A History of Electricity and Life by Arthur Firstenberg. Introduction. About the author. Arthur Firstenberg is a scientist and journalist who is at the forefront of a global movement to tear down the taboo surrounding this subject. And how? After graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Cornell University with a degree in mathematics, he attended the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine from 1978 to 1982. Injury by X-ray overdose cut short his medical career. For the past 37 years, he has been a researcher, consultant, and lecturer on the health and environmental effects of electromagnetic radiation, as well as a practitioner of several healing arts. About the book. This remarkably well-documented and referenced book is a cornerstone in the sense that it traces the deployment of electricity in our civilization, in terms of its interaction and living organisms, from its initial discovery in the 1740s all the way to our time, and even projected into the future. It should be noted that the title refers to the entire electromagnetic spectrum comprising the colors of the rainbow, including the invisible frequencies such as radio frequencies, and the fields generated around conducting wires. From the very beginning, captured in a bottle. 1746 saw the first discoveries involving electricity in Europe. Leiden's experiment consisted of revealing the electric fluid by means of rubbing the hand on a glass globe spun rapidly on its axis. The static electricity thus produced made a great impression in the schools, fairs, and on private persons who had the financial means to acquire this device, with some producing electrical arcs and others brief electric shocks. The phenomenon was so popular that it was not socially acceptable to suggest that electricity could be dangerous, even though the shocks caused headaches, nosebleeds, and fatigue in certain experimenters and in the animals used in the test. Society was taken over by electromania, and the most fervent exponents of being electroshocked in good company between two glasses of champagne began to receive harmful symptoms. In spite of this, the medical establishments equipped themselves with the Leyden flask, the forerunner of the condenser, for the purpose of carrying out medical experiments for abortions or other applications. Lovely. In this way, a completely new field of knowledge emerged concerning the biological effects of electricity on people, plants, and animals. Knowledge that was then much more extensive than that of our contemporary physicians, who daily see patients suffering from the effects of electricity without recognizing them for what they are, and who are generally ignorant of the very existence of this knowledge. 2. The deaf to hear and the lame to walk. Noting, rarely positive and far more often negative, effects of the application of electrical voltage on living organisms, the researchers and physicians concluded that living organisms function in a conjunction with electricity. Certain cures were brought about using electricity, as for example in 1851, when the neurologist Duchenne treated deafness in dozens of patients by means of locally applied electrical impulses. Experiments were carried out, notably by Volta in Italy, as well as other researchers in the Western world, which found evidence that the nervous, cardiac, cardiovascular, gustatory, salivatory, and other symptoms could be stimulated using the electricity produced by galvanic couples. It was found that the number of curative effects were significantly fewer than the harmful effects that were listed, which include the symptoms of electrosensitivity, ES, known today, such as headaches, dizziness, nausea, mental confusion, fatigue, depression, insomnia, etc. Electrical sensitivity. French botanist Thomas Francis Dalibard, who carried out electrical experiments on living organisms, confided in a letter to Benjamin Franklin, dated 1762, that he was unable to continue his work, as his own organism had developed an intolerance to electricity. He was one of the first people to be officially declared electro-hypersensitive, EHS. Reading that account, it is clear that this botanist must have been severely affected. Other professors and researchers had the same unfortunate experience and were thus forced to stop their work. Even the famous Benjamin Franklin was affected by a neurological illness during his researches on electricity from 1753 onwards, and the symptoms are largely reminiscent of electro-hypersensitivity. Come to think of it, maybe that was what was wrong with Tesla. Too much electricity. So much so that, at the end of the 18th century, it was generally acknowledged that electricity could make people ill, depending on the sex of the electricity. I assume he means negative or positive. The morphology and the physical condition of the individual concerned. It had similarly been observed that certain individuals reacted strongly to changes in the weather, which often correlated with electrical changes in the atmosphere. The names of some of those individuals are still famous today. Among them, Christopher Columbus, Dante, Charles Darwin, Benjamin Franklin, Goethe, Victor, Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci, Martin Luther, Michelangelo, Mozart, Napoleon, Rousseau, and Voltaire. The road not taken. During the 1790s, science was faced with an identity crisis regarding the interpretation of the unification of the four different fluids: electricity, light, magnetism, and heat. Where electricity was concerned, on the one hand, there was Luigi Galvani, who regarded electricity as an integral part of the living organism, and on the other, Volta's theory that electricity was only a secondary effect of internal chemical reactions in the living organism. Volta, the inventor of the extremely useful electric battery, which had the potential to become a great money spinner, succeeded in winning the argument against the more global view of the interaction between electricity and the living organism. Chronic electrical illness. From the end of the 19th century onwards, urban landscapes were transformed by the installation of telegraph lines throughout the industrialized countries. This technology uses voltages of the order of 80 volts on a single conductor, with the return current being earthed. That period saw the emergence of the first stray currents to which living beings were exposed. It was then that one saw the appearance of diseases of civilization, such as neurasthenia, which afflicted Frank Lloyd Wright and Theodore Roosevelt, among other well-known figures. It should be noted in passing that neurasthenia is nearly similar to electro-hypersensitivity, which is the more modern term for the same sensitivity to electricity. Around half of the telegraphists who were employed to manipulate the electrical current sent through the lines and were thus exposed to very strong electromagnetic fields were afflicted by telegraphic sickness. Once again, the symptoms were the same as those of EHS. Later on, in around 1915, it was the telephone operators who were experiencing the same symptom, for they were exposed to the electromagnetic fields from the communications for hours on end at their desks. In 1989, it was noted that in Winnipeg, 47% of the telephone operators were suffering from the same symptoms. However, in 1894, the noted Viennese psychiatrist Sigmund Freud wrote an article whose effect was disastrous. For all the unfortunates who suffered from telegraphic sickness, neurasthenia, microwave syndrome, or EHS, rather than seeing the external cause, which was electromagnetic pollution. He attributed these symptoms to disordered thoughts or poorly controlled emotions. As a result, today millions of citizens afflicted by electronic smog are being medicated instead of reducing their exposure to this pollutant. Sigmund Freud renamed neurasthenia, which was known to be caused by electricity, as a neurosis, anxiety, an anxiety attack or panic attack. This opened the way for the reckless deployment of electrification to continue unimpeded. It should be noted that in Russia, neurasthenia is listed as an environmental illness, as Freud's damaging redefinition was rejected there. 6. The behavior of plants. Sir Jagadish Chandra Bose and other researchers conducted numerous electrical experiments on plants and other living organisms, whose results showed definite effects. He discovered that the nerves of the plants or animals display variable behavior and that their resistivity can vary considerably, depending on the application of the current and its polarity. He also noted that the intensity of current necessary to modify the conductivity of the nerves is infinitesimal in terms of the voltage applied, something in the order of 0.3 microamperes, or 0.3. That current is significantly less than the current that is induced through a telephone conversation using a cell phone. Bose likewise discovered that the threshold of a current's bioactivity is 1 femtoampere, as this researcher was also familiar with radio frequency transmissions. He carried out an experiment in which a plant was exposed to a radio signal of 30 megahertz at a distance of about 218 yards, 200 meters, and found that the plant's growth was retarded during the emission period. He likewise showed that the circulation of sap in the plant slowed down when it was irradiated by the same radio signal. 7. Acute electrical illness. During the 1880s, London was supplied with direct current, but certain physicists had discovered that the distribution of alternating current generated fewer ohmic losses in the wires. There followed a battle of currents. Even though many scientists, including Edison, strongly criticized the more dangerous effects of alternating current, ironically, it's precisely because alternating current is more harmful that it is used in the electric chair. And as everyone knows, the electrical current of the power grid is alternating. In 1889, full-scale electrification was carried out in the USA, shortly thereafter in Europe, the same year, as if by chance, doctors were inundated with cases of flu, which had until then appeared only infrequently. The victims' symptoms were far more neurological in nature, resembling neurasthenia, and did not include respiratory disorders. The pandemic lasted for 4 years and killed at least a million people. In 2001, Canadian astronomer Ken Tapping showed that the influenza pandemics over the previous 3 centuries correlated with peaks in solar magnetic activity on an 11-year cycle. It has also been found that some outbreaks of influenza spread over enormous areas in just a few days, a fact that is difficult to explain by contagion from one person to another. Also, numerous experiments seeking to prove direct contagion through close contact, droplets of mucus, sounds familiar, or other processes have proved fruitless. From 1933 to the present day, Virologists have been unable to present any experimental study proving that influenza spreads through normal contact between people. All attempts to do so have met with failure. Mystery on the Isle of Wight. In 1904, bees began to die on the Isle of Wight, following the installation of radio transmitters by Marconi. These transmitters work at frequencies close to megahertz levels. On the other side of the channel, Jacques Arsène d'Arsenaval, I'm sorry if I butchered that, showed that sharp and hooked electromagnetic signals are far more toxic than sinusoidal signals. The truth was that after a year and a half of experimenting with radio transmitters in full health at the age of 22, Marconi began to develop fevers. These attacks continued for the rest of his life. In 1904, while working on setting up a transmitter powerful enough for the transatlantic communications, these fevers became so intense that they were thought to be malaria. In 1905, he married Beatrice O'Brien, and after their honeymoon, they settled on the island close to a transmitter. As soon as Beatrice had settled in, she began to complain of tinnitus. After 3 months, she fell ill with severe jaundice. She had to return to London to give birth to a baby who only lived a few weeks and died of unknown causes. During the same period, Marconi spent several months suffering from fever and delirium. Between 1918 and 1921, he suffered suicidal depression while working shortwave transmitter. In 1927, while on his honeymoon from his second marriage, he collapsed with chest pain and was diagnosed with serious cardiac disorders. Between 1934 and 1937, while he was developing microwave technology, he had 9 heart attacks, the final one killing him at the age of 63. On the same island, at Osborne House, Queen Victoria suffered cerebral hemorrhages and died on the evening of January 22, 1901, just as Marconi was putting a new transmitter into operation less than 13 miles away. In 1901, there were only 2 transmitters, while in 1904 there were 4, making this island the most irradiated place on the planet, leaving bees no room for survival. In 1906, a survey revealed that 90% of the bees had completely disappeared for no apparent reason. The colonies were brought to the island. New colonies were brought to the island, but these likewise died within a week. This epidemic spread across England, and then across the Western world, and then gradually stabilized, until the armies equipped themselves with various high-powered radio transmitters towards the end of the First World War, triggering, as we have seen, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, which actually began in the United States at the Naval Radio School of Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 400 initial cases. The epidemic rapidly spread to 1,127 soldiers at Funston Camp, Kansas, where wireless connections had been installed. What intrigued the doctors was that while 15% of the civilian population were suffering from nosebleeds, 40% of the Navy suffered from them. Other bleeding also occurred, and a third of those who died did so due to internal hemorrhaging of the lungs and brain. It's terrible. Man, it's just an awful way to go. And a third, the composition of the blood that had been altered, as the measured coagulation time was more than twice as long as normal. These symptoms are incompatible with the effects of the influenza respiratory viruses. but totally consistent with the devastating effects of electricity. Another incongruity was that 2/3 of the victims were healthy young people. A further atypical flu symptom was that the pulse slowed to rates between 36 and 48, whereas this is a common result of exposure to electromagnetic fields. In addition, it was possible to successfully treat some sufferers with massive doses of calcium. The military physician, Dr. George A. Soper, testified that the virus was spreading faster than the speed of movement of people. Various experiments were conducted attempting to infect subjects either by direct close contact or by inoculation with mucus or blood, but experimenters were unable to demonstrate any infection by this means. Each new influenza pandemic corresponds to a new advance in electrical technology, such as the Asian flu of 1957-58, following the installation of a powerful radar surveillance system, the outbreak of the Hong Kong flu from early 1968 onwards, following the commissioning of 28 military satellites for space surveillance at the altitude of the Van Allen belts, which protect us from cosmic radiation. 9. Earth's electric envelope. With a core consisting mainly of iron, the rotating Earth is primarily protected by the ionosphere, then the plasmasphere, delimited by the Van Allen radiation belts at an altitude of between 1,000 and 55,000 kilometers. That's quite a ways. And by its tail, the magnetosphere, which is exposed to solar winds originating from our sun and constitutes a kind of dynamo, a complex electrical system. The exchanges of electricity between the Earth's crust and the atmosphere, and even the ionosphere, are permanent and constant. They are in a delicate balance. Yes, and HAARP just pushing them things out there. Crazy. And a kind of electrical respiration of the entire system has allowed life to develop on our planet, which is charged with negative ions, balanced by the positively charged ionosphere. An average vertical electrical field of the order of 130 volts per meter can be observed, with values that can, for example, rise to 4,000 volts per meter during storms. In 1953, one of the primary parameters of this electrical oscillation of our environment was discovered in the form of Winfried-Schumann's frequencies, which respire at 7.83 Hertz, with harmonics at 14, 20, 26, and 32 Hertz, called very low frequencies, VLF. It is no wonder that the organisms living in this environment are imbued with these physical values, and that, for example, our brain rhythms lie within these frequency ranges, such as the alpha rhythm, which lies between 8 and 13 Hertz, while we perceive the visible frequencies ranging from blue to red of the electromagnetic spectrum. Some animals are able to see other electromagnetic frequencies, such as bees, which can see ultraviolet frequencies, or those salamanders or catfish, which can see the low electrical frequencies, while snakes are able to see the infrared frequencies. Laboratory experiments on hamsters, for example, showed that reducing the temperature and shortening the duration of daylight was not enough to put them into hibernation. Similarly, hamsters raised in Faraday cages refused to hibernate, even though the light and temperature parameters correspond to those of winter, until the Faraday protection was removed. Other experiments were conducted, such as that carried out at the Max Planck Institute in 1967 by the physiologist Rutger Weaver, using 2 buried rooms without windows or outside contact. one shielded from natural electromagnetic fields, the other one not. It was shown that in the shielded chamber, the circadian rhythms of the volunteers became desynchronized and could vary between 12 and 65 hours, accompanied by metabolic disorders, while the subjects in the chamber immersed in the Earth's fields kept a coherent rhythm of about 24 hours, and their metabolism continued to function more normally. It has been scientifically demonstrated that a living organism needs to be bathed in the electromagnetic system of our natural environment in order to function well. Moreover, acupuncture, the ancient method used in traditional Chinese medicine, works by using our own electrical properties and modifying the energy flow of the meridians. It has been known for some time, since the 1950s, that these meridians actually correspond to electrical circuits, and that the Chinese qi corresponds to the concept of electricity. These meridians serve dual functions. They not only transport information and energy internally from one organ of the body to another, but also serve as antennas for picking up the flow of environmental electromagnetic energy. In the early 1970s, the atmospheric physicists discovered that the Earth's magnetic field was significantly disturbed by human electrical activity. By injecting a signal into space and capturing its echo, it was established that the initial signal had in fact been modified by multiples of the 60 Hertz powered grid used in North America. However, this discovery did not prevent the HARP project from being launched to deliberately modify the electromagnetic properties of our planet. I mean, they're just so brilliant. Similarly, the Van Allen belts that protect us from cosmic rays have already been altered by our electrical activity. And it may be that these double belts were originally only a single belt, which, under the influence of human emission of electric charges into space, has been depleted at its center. Interesting. I'm just thinking about something that Michael Tessarion once said. Satellite observations show that the radiation emitted by high voltage lines often has the effect of suppressing the natural radiation of lightning. In light of this fact, it is logical to conclude that the influenza pandemics of recent decades are linked to human electrical activity. Porphyrins and the basis of life. Number 10. Any transformation of energy in the biological domain involves porphyrins, pigments made up of 4 pyrrole molecules. The fact that our nerves are able to function properly is thanks in part to porphyrins, which play a role in our cell processes. These are special molecules that function as the interface between oxygen and life. These molecules are highly reactive and interact with toxic metals or synthetic elements derived from oil, and with electromagnetic fields, which in excess cause porphyria, which is more an environmental sensitivity than a disease. Dr. William E. Morton's research showed that 90% of people with multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, are deficient in one form of porphyrin enzyme or another, as are electrohypersensitive individuals, which means that the 2 forms of sensitivity are only different manifestations, with one and the same cause. Porphyria, which was discovered in 1891, afflicts about 10% of today's population, and first appeared at the same time as the general electrification of the Western world, from 1889 onwards. Porphyrins are central to the effects of electric smog, because they not only cause EHS, MCS, or porphyria, but also cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and diabetes, as they are involved in a multiple of energetic biological processes. In the 1960s, the biologists Alan Frey and Lodzimmers Sedlak showed that our organisms definitely have a bioelectric component, and that some of our cells sometimes behave like conductors or capacitors, or semiconductors, transistors, like the components that we find in our electric devices. This is the case with myelin, the sheath that covers our nerves, which contains porphyrin bonded to zinc. Should environmental poisons, such as chemical products or toxic metals, affect this equilibrium? The myelin sheath will be damaged, which alters the excitability of the nerves it surrounds. The entire nervous system then becomes hyper-responsive to stimuli of all kinds, such as electromagnetic fields. The system enters a state of divergent instability, the effect becoming the cause. Contrary to the view that mitochondria are the elements of our cells that produce energy, the concept of the myelin sheath as being one giant mitochondrion is beginning to gain credence. The connection between porphyria and zinc was discovered in the 1950s by Henry Peters at Wisconsin Medical School. Patients suffering from porphyria and neurological symptoms were excreting a great deal of zinc in their urine, which led him to the idea that zinc chelating might improve their condition. He did indeed see an improvement. Despite the widespread belief that zinc deficiency is related to those specific disorders, similarly, certain experiments have shown that zinc chelating improves Alzheimer's disease. An Australian medical team demonstrated in autopsies that the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease contain twice as much zinc as those of healthy patients. So yeah, zinc overdosing is not good. Especially today when we're told that zinc kills COVID. Then, we might be seeing a lot of people getting zinc overdose. That's not good. That's why I take zinc with calcium and magnesium to try to balance